And particularly being in Windsor, for me, Windsor is her, so she loved it here. She spent most of her time here. Showing you around today is very much a case I'm trying to make sure I'm doing it the way she'd want you to.
She used to say the whole point of Ravensmoor was that nobody had to perform there. That was the word Wren always used to perform. She had spent her whole adult life performing, and the one thing she wanted for her children was a house where they didn't have to. That is the story I want to tell you, because to understand what happened underneath Thornfield Cottage, you first have to understand why that cottage existed at all. Prince Edmund and Princess Wren of Alderland do not run. That isn't a comment on their nerve, it's a fact about how they were made. Edmund spent 8 years in the Alderland Royal Marines before the Crown pulled him back into full-time duty. Wren had walked into state dinners, hospital wards, and funeral processions with 100 cameras on her face and given away nothing but calm. These are two people trained, almost from birth, to hold still under pressure. So when they ran on a cold Tuesday night in late November, you have to ask what it took to make them do it. When Edmund and Wren announced, 4 years ago, that they were moving their young family from the palace grounds to a modest cottage on the edge of the Ravensmoor estate, the papers treated it as a lifestyle story. Smaller house. Less grandeur. A prince and princess trading marble for a garden. Thornfield Cottage had been chosen over 3 larger, grander properties available to them. It had a kitchen where Wren actually cooked. It had a garden with a wall low enough for the children to see over, but high enough that photographers on the public footpath couldn't see in. It had bedrooms with doors that closed, in a life that otherwise had very few doors that stayed shut. They gave up a great deal to live there, proximity to the seat of power, easy access to staff. The reassuring solidity of ancient stone walls 3 feet thick. They chose the smaller, softer house anyway, because they had decided, quite deliberately, that Theo, Iris, and Finn would have as much of an ordinary childhood as 3 future obligations to a crown could possibly be allowed to have. Edmund had grown up in the wing of a palace, where a nanny's footsteps in a marble hallway could be heard 3 rooms away, where every meal was announced before it arrived, and every friendship was quietly vetted before it was allowed to continue. He had told Wren more than once in the early years of their marriage that he didn't want his own children to learn the particular loneliness of a house too large to be filled by the people who loved you. Wren, who had married into that world rather than been born to it, understood the ache in that sentence better than most people around them ever gave her credit for. So they had walked the smaller properties on the estate together, the 2 of them alone with an estate agent who had been sworn to more confidentiality than most cabinet ministers, and they had chosen the one that felt like somewhere a family could actually live rather than merely reside. A crooked back staircase the children could thunder down without an usher wincing. A vegetable patch that never quite yielded what the seed packets promised. A kitchen table with one leg slightly shorter than the others, propped level with a folded beer mat that nobody had ever bothered to replace. It was not a grand gesture. That was rather the point. Every choice they made about that house was a small, deliberate refusal of the life either of them had been handed. And a small, deliberate attempt to build something better for the 3 children currently asleep upstairs while their parents debated skirting boards and drainage. Hold on to that. Because what happened underneath that house wasn't just an intrusion. It was the undoing of a plan. It started with nothing more dramatic than a maintenance order. Thornfield Cottage was old parts of it dated to the 17th century, and every few years the estate's structural engineers went through with instruments and clipboards to check the foundations hadn't shifted. It was routine. Nobody expected the evening to become anything else. 17 minutes into the inspection, one of the engineers found a cavity behind a section of cellar wall that didn't appear on any survey. Behind it, a passage. Stone cut. Narrow. Clearly old, but with air moving through it in a way that suggested it connected to something. By the time a second engineer had gone 20 feet in with a torch, it was no longer a maintenance job. It was a security matter, and the estate's protection command was called before the engineers had even climbed back out. Here is the detail that still unsettles me most. Nothing in Thornfield's records, going back 3 centuries, mentioned a tunnel. Every survey before that night had come back clean. Whatever ran beneath that cottage had been forgotten so completely that not one person on the household payroll knew it existed. Tunnels alone are an inconvenience. You seal them, log them, move on. What made this different was what the passage led to, and how recently someone had been using it. Protection officers do not wake a royal household lightly. When they do, it means the assessment has already been made that waiting until morning is not an option. Edmund Woke First Old Training does that to a person, a shift in the quiet of the house registering somewhere below conscious thought before a single word has been said. Wren woke seconds after him, the way people with small children in the house tend to. Neither spoke. Two people who have spent their adult lives being watched learn early that in the first minute of any crisis, listening tells you more than asking does. The knock was soft, but it didn't stop. Edmund crossed the room and opened the door to Callum Reeve, head of the family's protection detail, with two more officers positioned behind him in the corridor. Reeve's face had already told them most of it before he said a word. The structural team, he explained, had found signs of recent human activity in the passage below the cellar. Not decades old. Recent. A folding stool. Water bottles with purchase dates from weeks earlier. A thermal blanket, still faintly warm. And photographs, not historical images, but recent ones, of the family. Taken from angles that made clear whoever held the camera knew their routines. Reeve gave it to Edmund in the fewest words he could manage, and those close to the family say Edmund repeated them to Wren exactly as he'd heard them. Someone has been living under the house. Not at the gate, not over the wall, under the floor of the room where their youngest son slept. Wren didn't wait for the rest of the briefing. The instant she understood the question was her children's safety, she was already moving down the hall. Theo, 11, old enough to sense that something serious was happening even before anyone told him so. Iris, 9, sharper than most adults gave her credit for, and the one who asked the question that cut straight through her mother's careful calm. "Are we safe here, Mummy?" Wren paused. Half a second. No more. Edmund saw it from the doorway and understood exactly what that half-second had cost her. The evacuation itself ran the way these things are designed to run when they're rehearsed for, and never used 3 cars on the drive with engines already turning over, routes agreed in advance, emergency bags pulled from storage where they are kept updated, quietly, 4 times a year. Sit with that detail for a moment. A family's whole existence organized, in the background. Around a departure they hoped they would never have to make. Edmund carried Finn, 6 years old, half asleep down the stairs against his shoulder. Wren followed with a hand on each of the older two, one of Finn's shoes still clutched in her free hand where it had come off somewhere on the landing. On the gravel outside, in the cold, she turned back for one last look at the house-warm windows. Curtains still drawn, a home standing exactly as it had a few hours before, except that it wasn't that anymore. Edmund found her hand. They left. By morning, forensic tents stood on the lawn at Thornfield, each positioned over a different point where the old passage broke the surface. Detective Chief Inspector Priya Nandan, who had built her career on historical property crime and held the clearance required to work anywhere near the royal household, took the case at midnight. Her team went in with ground-penetrating radar, the same technology used to find voids and cavities beneath solid ground without breaking the surface, and what the scan produced was worse than anyone in that briefing room had prepared for. The passage did not stop at Thornfield's cellar. It ran on. It connected to the older service tunnels beneath the main house at Ravensmoor. It touched 2 further properties on the estate. For an unknown length of time, possibly years, there had existed a way of moving across the entire estate that bypassed every gate, every camera, every system, built by people whose job was to imagine exactly this kind of threat. And in one chamber, directly beneath the room where 6-year-old Finn slept, they found a camp. A chair. A blanket. Enough water to last for days at a stretch. And more photographs, not random snapshots, but a curated, deliberate collection that told investigators precisely what their subject had been watching, the school run, Wren's morning route across the grounds, the exact quarter hour each day when the protection shift changed and the estate went quieter than at any other hour. Nobody stumbles onto a pattern like that. That's research. That's someone doing homework with the discipline of a professional. The number investigators kept returning to, once the older camps further down the passage were dated, was 2. Not weeks, not months. The earliest evidence pointed to almost 2 years of intermittent use, 2 winters, 2 Christmases with a tree glowing in a window 20 feet above, 2 summers of a garden full of children's noise, with someone lying in the dark beneath every single day of it, writing in a notebook. The journals came out of the tunnel in poor condition and went straight to forensic document specialists. The handwriting grew harder to read, as the volumes progressed, a slow deterioration on the page that seemed to track something else. A man coming further and further loose from the world above ground. Wren's reaction to that detail, according to people in the room, was not panic. It was something closer to controlled fury, the particular fury of a mother discovering that a boundary she had believed was solid had never existed at all. The digital trail wasn't hard to find once investigators knew what to look for. A moderator on an online history forum flagged a set of posts that had troubled him for over a year. Written under the name Deepstone Wanderer Theories about forgotten treasure beneath royal estates, annotated maps that matched, almost line for line, documents later recovered from the tunnel. Dr. Elena Marsh, a psychologist who studies obsessive fixation on public figures, was brought in to map the pattern, which she said followed a shape she'd documented many times before. Interest becomes study, study becomes theory, theory becomes grievance. And at some point, the person stops being someone who reads about a family and starts believing the family is the obstacle standing between him and something he is owed. His name, when it surfaced, was Cormac Doyle 46, a former archivist at a small regional historical trust, let go 3 years earlier after colleagues grew concerned about his behavior. After that, by all accounts, the search beneath Ravensmoor became the only thing he did with his time. What made him dangerous rather than simply pitiable was that he was good at his obsession. He could read a 17th century estate plan. He knew how to work an archive without leaving a trace. He had exactly the training required to find a door that had fallen off the official records 400 years earlier and, increasingly, nothing else in his life to hold his attention. In his journals, the entries about the family had started as plain observation times, weather, routines, and slowly changed register, becoming familiar, almost intimate, as though he had built a relationship in his head with a woman and 3 children who had never once seen his face. King Alaric received his briefing at first light and, by every account, kept his composure in front of staff. What he said to his son afterward, in private, is not recorded. But people who know the family well point to a piece of Ashcombe history that made this land harder than it otherwise might have. 60 years earlier, an intruder known to history simply as the Belhaven Man had scaled a perimeter wall at the old summer palace and reached the late Queen's private apartments before he was found sitting, uninvited, in her sitting room. It became the incident against which every subsequent security review at every Ashcombe property was measured. Every improvement made in 6 decades had been designed around someone coming over the wall. Nobody had built a single defense for someone coming from underneath it. This part is hard to write without weight, and I won't pretend otherwise. Finn began having nightmares about monsters in the ground, the only shape a 6-year-old's mind could give to a midnight evacuation he didn't understand. Wren sat with him, night after night, telling him patiently that the ground beneath their new rooms was simply ground. Iris took a different path. She started checking the door locks before bed, then checking them again. A 9-year-old confirming, twice, that every window was shut is a small thing to watch and an enormous thing to sit beside every night, and her mother let her do it. Understanding that Iris needed the ritual more than she needed to be told to stop. Theo went quiet, watching his parents' faces for the worry they were trying to keep off them. Edmund found him one evening standing at a window, shoulders set in a way that stopped him mid-step in the doorway, because he recognized the posture from photographs of himself at the same age. He had promised himself, long before any of this, that his children would never have to carry a fear alone the way he sometimes had. That promise was tested by an 11-year-old quietly asking whether the man was still out there. Edmund answered him honestly, because he'd decided a long time ago that honesty, delivered gently, was owed to a child old enough to ask the question properly. Footage review kept returning to one figure near Thornfield too often to be coincidence, and his vehicle led investigators to a rented cottage 3 miles away. When officers arrived, it was empty, cleared out in a hurry, but not carelessly. He had taken what mattered and gone, apparently within hours of the tunnels being found, as though he had somehow known before anyone told him. The search that followed used resources normally reserved for far larger threats. Detailed knowledge of 2 more royal properties turned up in his notes, professional-grade surveillance equipment, 2 years of underground preparation aimed at something no one could yet name with confidence. Dr. Marsh's updated assessment was blunt isolation, obsession. And now the public humiliation of losing the tunnels tend to push a person from watching toward acting. Nobody wanted to finish that sentence out loud. For 6 weeks, the investigation ran on 2 tracks at once. Above ground, uniformed officers worked the ordinary channels, bus stations, rail platforms, the handful of guest houses within walking distance of the coast that might take a man paying in cash and asking no questions. Below ground, a specialist unit finished mapping every remaining inch of the passage system, working by torchlight through chambers that hadn't seen fresh air in decades. Cataloging what Doyle had left behind, as though it were a crime scene frozen mid-sentence. What they found, methodically bagged and logged over those 6 weeks, told its own story. A second, smaller cache of supplies near the tunnel's far end, clearly intended for a return visit that never came. A partially burned notebook, as though he had tried and failed to destroy it in a hurry. And, tucked behind a loose stone near the very last chamber, a child's hair ribbon that investigators would later confirm had gone missing from the Thornfield garden the previous spring, dismissed at the time as simply lost. That single object did more to reshape the tone of the investigation than anything else recovered. A folding chair and a thermal blanket suggested obsession. A stolen ribbon, kept and apparently treasured, suggested something closer to a private relationship existing only in one man's head, and it was the detail that finally moved Dr. Marsh to tell Reeve plainly that in her professional judgment, Doyle no longer distinguished clearly between the family as they were and the family as he had constructed them in his journals. Nobody wanted to finish that sentence out loud either. 3 weeks after the evacuation, Edmund and Wren had the conversation they'd both been avoiding. The security upgrades, every tunnel entrance sealed, sensors installed, the full architecture of a modern system were all correct, all necessary, and none of them solved the actual problem. You can seal stone. You cannot seal a memory. Wren walked through the cottage alone before they left it for the last time, the kitchen where she'd made birthday cakes. The sitting room where Friday film nights had become a small, sacred ritual. The bedrooms where 3 babies had become 3 children with their own opinions and arguments and particular weight in her arms. None of it erased. All of it changed. Thornfield had been the answer to a question she and Edmund had asked themselves before Theo was born, whether it was possible to raise children who were royal without raising them only as royal. Standing in that kitchen for the last time, she said quietly that the question now felt naive, and the guilt in her voice made no logical sense, and didn't leave anyway. The official statement ran to a single sentence about infrastructure works. By evening, it was everywhere, front pages, empty driveway footage in the rain, well-wishers arriving at the gates with flowers, because that is what people do when they don't know what else to offer. There's a thread that runs quietly under this whole story, and it isn't really about tunnels. It's about the particular grief of parents who did everything right and still lost the one thing they'd built on purpose, a house where their children didn't have to perform. Edmund and Wren didn't lose Thornfield to a threat with a name. They lost it to knowledge. Once you know what was beneath your children's bedrooms for 2 years, the house stops being able to give you what it once did. No matter how many sensors go into the walls. Cormac Doyle was never found. There was no treasure under Ravensmoor. There never had been just old stone, groundwater, and 4 centuries of misplaced paperwork. What he actually took, in the end, wasn't gold. It was a family's belief that they were safe inside their own front door. On Christmas Eve, with the children finally asleep, Edmund and Wren stood together at a window and talked about spring, about where they might live next, what kind of garden it might have. Neither of them said the obvious thing out loud, that Thornfield was probably finished for them, not because it had failed, but because they now knew too much about what it had been hiding. The tunnels can be sealed, the locks can be changed, every item on a security list can be signed off, one by one.